Sí.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Denis Foretia. I'm the executive chairman of the Nkafu Policy Institute, which is a think tank based in Cameroon, based in Yaoundé, Cameroon. And it's a great honor for me, privilege to host and moderate this important panel session during the third Southern Voice Research Conference. This conference, which is now day 2 of 3 days, is under the theme, this particular session rather is under the theme, the equity conundrum. Can Global South think tanks glocalize the development agenda? And it's an important conversation, especially in the COVID era where we find ourselves today. So on behalf of our entire team, I want to welcome you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us today. Now, the issue of equity in particular is very important today as the world recovers from COVID-19. Equally important is how Global South think tanks exert themselves to be able to influence this development agenda. How do we glocalize the development agenda, especially how do we glocalize COVID-19 response to ensure that the response is very equitable in nature? And that is the main theme of the conference that we are honored to be part of. While the concept of globalization is now very much understood, glocalization, on the other hand, is relatively new. Now, that glocalization refers to the growing importance of ensuring that continental and global concepts or policies are contextualized in increasingly salient forms to meet local and regional realities. Thus, it is increasingly important for us to contextualize the policies that are really usually driven from the global north to ensure that they work in our local context. Now, these are some of the issues that we are looking forward to discussing today. And I am extremely honored to have a wonderful set of panelists who are joining us today. Now, joining us from Kenya is Professor Jane Kabubo-Mariara, who is the Executive Director of the Partnership for Economic Policy, PEPNet, that is based in Nairobi. She is a professor of economics at the University of Nairobi, where she served as a director of the School of Economics from 2010 to 2016. And currently, Jane is a member of the Central Bank of Kenya's Monetary Policy Committee. So we are really honored to have her. Joining us from Mexico is Dr. Laure Delalande, who is the Director of Innovation and Sustainable Development at Ethos Public Policy Lab. Thank you, Laure, for joining us as well. Also joining us from Indonesia is Heufers. Reina is the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies that is based in Jakarta. He is also the founder and managing director of SAP Solutions Limited, which is a Singapore-based training and consulting firm. It's an honor to have you, Reina, again on a panel. Last, certainly not the least, is Dr. Len Ishmael. Len, thanks for joining us. And Dr. Ishmael is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South based in Rabat, Morocco. She is the former ambassador of the Eastern Caribbean states to the Kingdom of Belgium and the European Union. She is also the past president of the 79-member African, Caribbean, and Pacific Committee of Ambassadors in Brussels. Also interesting is that Len is a former director of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And as I just found out recently, she is a commissioner of the Lancet Commission on COVID. So we have a very stellar panel of experts joining us today. Now, I wanted to, before we start, try to get an idea of who is joining us. So I don't know if our communications team can put a poll up to find out where folks are joining us from. If not, we can start directly. I think I see there is a link on in the chat for folks to to just to have an idea of where people are joining from. Or you can just put it in the chat. That way we know folks joining us from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia. And just give some ideas there, and we'll go from there. All right. So we see folks from Cameroon, Indonesia. Okay. Also, we see lots of folks from Latin America. So Latin America is winning the day today. I don't know what Andrea did, on that, but very good. Now, let's see a second poll. So we have Africa, Latin America, Europe. It's very good for the first time that North America is the minority. So that's pretty good. Right there. All right. Well, thank you very much, Ansel, for those. Let me start with you, Jane. As you know, one of the major issues that has come out of COVID policies is really the issue of equity, the equity question. What we are talking about today, the equity conundrum, if I may. Now, you run a very important think tank that is that has great work being done across the continent in Kenya in particular. I want you to take a look at what role have you seen the Global South think tanks play in influencing the prevailing COVID-19 policies. What are some of the actions, research that you've undertaken, or the policy work that PEP in particular has undertaken or is undertaking in this area to really inform how we are recovering from COVID?
Okay, thank you very much, Denis, and thank you both Nkafu Institute and Southern Voice for this opportunity to be part of this distinguished panel and this great conference. First, let me say that, Denis, when you are introducing this and defining glocalization, you seem to define what PEP does. So it's really exciting for me to be part of this and maybe talk a bit about what we are doing to contribute to this work and maybe what glocalization means for all of us. So first on your question, you are asking what we have seen, the role that we've seen Global South think tanks play in influencing prevailing COVID policies. Maybe first what I would say, and maybe giving it more perspective from PEP and also from my own self, is that the research that global think tanks are doing, or think tanks in the Global South are doing, may not necessarily directly be affecting the policies imposed in different countries in terms of dealing with the crisis. But still, most of the policies, or why I'm saying they may not be influencing directly, is because most of the policies are set by different countries individually. If you look at Kenya, for instance, maybe the COVID crisis support policies that we have will be different from the ones in Cameroon, for instance. But we know very well that the influence of the policies on the ground depends on, first, the local government policy, maybe how think tanks are fed into that particular country, and there could be external factors such as listening to WHO and so forth. So basically what we see is that different countries have set up maybe different kind of policies, depending maybe on the rank and the severity of the crisis. They have had different levels of lockdown. There have been different forms of fiscal stimulus and so forth. However, we can say that research and the policies that have been done by the think tanks actually have helped the countries to adapt and plan for post-COVID recovery. Though we still have that uncertainty that we don't know at what point we are going to recover from COVID, we see that a lot of the research that think tanks are doing in the Global South are feeding into those policies of post-COVID recovery. And one of the things that we think will have great influence in the future will be issues such as maybe focusing on green economy, just transition, what an ideal fiscal stimulus should be in order to generate employment, to deal with inequality, and so forth. I would also add that the current research by think tanks in the Global South really point at what, Denis, you are calling the equity conundrum with regard to a number of things. Maybe one of it is the question of the rollout of vaccinations, and also accessibility of vaccines in the Global South. And we know that this relates strongly to unequal access to vaccines and how they have been distributed in the developing world or in the Global South. And this is where, as we know, the Global South is not really manufacturing much of vaccines. They don't have the means, they don't have the resources, and they do not also have maybe the resources to import vaccines from outside there. The research in these countries have also highlighted how policies imposed by countries, especially in the developed world, with regards to the vaccines are affecting countries in the Global South. Maybe just to give an example, starting with Africa again, we know that we've had a bit of travel restrictions. South Africa is a very good case because remember that South Africa does produce vaccines. And even though South Africa has been producing vaccines, it's one of those countries that I don't know whether it's even been released now, but for a long time has been on the red list to travel to the UK. I remember actually one renowned professor from South Africa saying that it feels like apartheid all over again. There has been the issue of vaccine passports, and of course, the issue of recognition of some vaccines, such as maybe COVID shield, which we know is what was being used in most of Africa, most of Asia, and yet people with that kind of vaccine certificate will not be allowed to travel to Europe. Other issues, maybe quickly, we know that the GDP of most of the African countries, for instance, has been wiped out by COVID. This is part of what the research in these countries is showing. And of course, trying to show these countries what they can do in order to ensure that they can ameliorate maybe the deepening poverty and inequality. We've seen a lot of gender differences that are coming out, or maybe women being disproportionately negatively affected by the pandemic. This we have seen in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, and in many countries. And what the research is showing is how these countries can actually benefit from the research or from the policies that we are proposing. So maybe, I don't know whether I still have a minute, maybe what I would say.
Yes, Jane, you can go ahead and conclude from there.
So coming maybe now closer to PEP, because I think you asked me what some of the actions, research, policy work that PEP is doing, maybe without repeating or being very specific on some of the things that I've touched on. We've been doing quite a bit of research ever since the onset of COVID. And this research, we are covering Asia, Africa, Latin America. And of course, our research is also portraying the equity dimension of the whole issue. And they're showing that this is central and it's critical if we are actually going to deal with the COVID crisis. And our work is really about simulating policy responses. What are the policies that actually can work in the global south? And one of the things that we are contributing is to provide evidence that is required by the government to deal with the COVID crisis in the developing south. And we focused on maybe looking at the effect on the most vulnerable, most affected population. Think about informal sector workers, think about women, think about farmers, and so forth. And our experience so far is that the research that we have produced has actually been assimilated in the policy dialogue in the countries that we have focused on. We are working in 11 countries spread across actually 2 in Latin America, 2 in Asia, and 7 in Africa. But maybe I would say that as I finish, I would say that what is behind the successful outcome of our work influencing policy is because of the kind of approach that we as PEP use, because we are trying to bring kind of cooperation where we want the local researchers to work with international experts. And these international experts are also mostly from the South as well, because you see, when we are talking about international experts, we just think about the North. So local-based researchers, Southern international experts, and country government officials. They work together to start from the onset, thinking about what are the key policy issues that need to be addressed, what are the research questions that need to be addressed to look at the problem at hand. Of course, our experience is that the questions are never the same across countries, but bringing this kind of tripartite collaboration really helps to actually tackle the issue. So in our view, just to finish, is that the role of the global think tanks is actually the role of the global southern think tanks is actually should be to support the locally based thought leaders so that then they can contribute to the policies that can be used to reduce the inequalities that are coming up because of the crisis. And we know that the crisis is just actually kind of cementing or excavating the inequalities that were there even from the beginning. So Dennis, maybe I'll stop there for now. I can come back with.
No, thank you very much, and Jane, for that. I think that is very expansive, the work that PEP is doing, but also the view of what Global South think tanks should be doing or are doing and should be doing to ensure that they are almost getting themselves into the driver's seat, in this recovery as far as policy formulation is concerned. Now, Reina, let me come to you quickly. As you, I mean, you Indonesia is hosting G20 next year, and you are intricately involved in preparations for that in the T20. The T20 holding on the sidelines of the G20. The T20 brings think tanks and academic research institutions from G20 member countries to ensure that they have great contributions towards the G20 dialogue. SIPS is involved in one of the tracks, and in one of the task force. You are leading the task force on agriculture and food security. Now, my quick question to you, especially regarding the subject here, is how are you anticipating, or are you looking forward to bringing more voices from the Global South into these discussions, especially on agriculture, where food insecurity remains really a vexing problem across the low and middle income countries. So how are you looking to give more voice to us?
Thank you, Denis. Pleasure to be here. Also an honor to be invited. I'm really glad I'm able to join this discussion. Yeah, I mean, we as think tanks, we all want to, of course, influence government policy, right, at the end of the day. And that's why we do what we do. And so we are looking for every opportunity we can get. And when the G20 comes to town, this, of course, is a massive opportunity. And G20 is by no means an ideal construct. We can have lengthy discussions about this, but the T20 actually allows think tanks to cooperate in policy briefs. And that's what we are trying to coordinate on our side in the area of agriculture. So the voices of the global South, well, this year's G20 just finished in Italy, but the next three are going to be in Indonesia, then India, and then Brazil. So, you know, this alone already allows topics and issues to be brought into global discussions if you want a little degree of localization, because the host country always has a bit of influence in what is going to be discussed. So, yeah, the T20 has its task forces, and the task forces are there to, yeah, formulate policy briefs based on policy briefs written by researchers and think tanks all over the world. Very soon, on the 30th of November, end of this month, there will be a call for abstracts. And I would like to encourage everyone here in this call to consider submitting an abstract. And the thing is, this is a global event. Therefore, this tripartite cooperation that Jane just mentioned is extremely important here. If a think tank from Indonesia would just write about an Indonesian issue, that wouldn't be really what we're looking for, because this got to be somewhat in the global dimension. So a cooperation between, for example, us and another think tank to talk about the issues as we see them on a global level, that would make a lot of sense to us. So yeah, please watch out for this opportunity. End of the month, there is a call for abstracts, 500 words. There will be a decision in January which abstracts are accepted to be turned into full policy briefs, which would then have to be done in a couple of months. Why agriculture? I would like to also make this a plea, to all of you, because sometimes agriculture is treated as a bit of a stepchild of the think tank world. We all deal with other issues than agriculture, but agriculture actually supplies a quarter of global employment. All of our food we get comes from agriculture, obviously. So, I mean, it's tremendously important. And many of us work in rural societies and where agriculture is still the dominant economy, but also lifestyle. So yeah, we have this as one of our focus areas, and that's why we are the host. We call it the host of this task force on sustainable agriculture and food security. And that touches on issues that many of you work on. I mean, agriculture touches on climate change, on food loss, on smallholder farming, COVID recovery, all of this, global value chains, etc. All of this matters also in the area of agriculture. So maybe I just use this opportunity, Denis, to ask everybody to be active in this, and if you want, collaborate with us or other think tanks in this.
Yes, thank you very much, Reina, for that, and we'll come back to you. But I think I was going to go with Len, but Len is going to join us back. So, Laure, let me come to you, if I may. Now, you know, there was a recent report from the United Nations in 2021 on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and it was titled "The Social and Economic Impacts of COVID-19 Pandemic." One of the captions rather was that the social and economic impacts of COVID-19 pandemic have adversely affected progress towards gender equality. Women have suffered a disproportionate share of job losses, similar to what Jane mentioned earlier. Now, from Mexico, as an example, what is your take on that, on this, you know, disproportionate job loss that we've seen across the world, especially in the global South? And what policies are you all working on in Mexico or in the region that is aimed at reducing these gender disparities or so, and ensuring that the response that we're trying to, the Build Back Better, can actually live up to that slogan. Because I think we are very good at developing slogans, but rarely do we actually have those slogans actualized. So what can you say regarding these disparities?
Thank you very much, Denis, and thank you for Thousand Voice for the invitation. So I would like to start saying that in Mexico, 7 out of 10 unemployed by the pandemic are women. And this is not just an issue of lack of jobs. With the closure of schools, many mothers have been forced to stay home with their children. And in the case of Mexico, children were out of school from March 2020 to August 2021. That is more than a year. 74% of mothers have assumed support for distance education at home, when only 5% of fathers have done so. So this situation shows a deep disdain of the Mexican government for the mental health of women. And besides COVID, Mexico suffers from another kind of pandemic, and that is violence. It has been worse and worse since March 2020, and in most cases against women. From March 2020 to July 2021, more than 300,000 crimes of family violence have been reported in the country. And only during August 2021, 107 femicides were reported in Mexico. And this is the highest number since at least 2015. So in this context of violence, without jobs, without incomes, and with an overload of unpaid work, we can affirm that the basic human rights, of women have been deeply violated. There has been no public recognition of this, and we do not know if these setbacks will continue in the medium and long term. If there is no collective conscience on this issue, the risk could become true, and we could be talking about the first historical setback in the gender agenda of this century. Now, in our country, more than 600 organizations of civil society works with women. Those are think tanks, but also NGOs. Now, there are 600 organizations, seem very few compared to the size of the challenge I mentioned before. We have to recognize that gender stereotypes are very deeply anchored in our society, as are violent behaviors as part of male identity and so on. Combined with the increasing crime rate by drug trafficking and criminal organization of all kinds, it gives us a mortal cocktail that explains this repeated tendency to use violence against women. So at this moment in the history of Mexico, the work agenda on gender issues must be a feminist agenda. We cannot afford to promote cross-cutting policies, but we need a deep reflection as a society on the role of men and women and their relationships and the way in which these relationships have been damaging our society. Now I will stop here and I will talk about Building Back Better after. Thank you.
Well, thank you, but Laure, that is a very sobering set of statistics there that you have you have highlighted the violence. 7 out of 10 of those who have lost their job being women. So it's a very sobering data set. Now, I don't know if Dr. Len Ishmael is with us now. Len, are you connected? If not, then Laure, I would come back to you, Laure, a little bit regarding just the Build Back Better that you are referring to, if I may, regarding how you all, as well as think tanks in Latin America or in the global South in general, how you all are approaching this Build Back Better. I know Jane had mentioned a little bit earlier regarding the way the work is being done, but also the specific policies being implemented by individual countries and how they are different. Can you talk a little bit now regarding the influence that think tanks in Latin America, for example, or in Mexico in particular, are having or plan to have?
Okay. Yes, and I would like to talk about the role of Global South in this, this debate. So to answer this question, I will give the example of an alliance that we formed in Ethos with other think tanks in Latin America. Together with Transforma in Colombia and Espacio Público in Chile, we created the Sustainable Latin America Alliance a few months after the beginning of the pandemic, with the aim of promoting a sustainable recovery in the region. So we saw the need to understand the context and specific challenges in Latin America to face the pandemic. And we jointly formulated several recommendations, policy papers, policy brief for governments to adopt sustainable recovery policies. Now, more than a year after starting this initiative, we are recounting what has happened. And the sad reality is that our governments have not been able to promote a sustainable recovery. The pandemic is synonymous with setbacks in many ways, but the environmental agenda is perhaps the one that has been most affected. So we decided to use other advocacy channels. In this case, we're working with the International Climate Policy Hub to highlight this reality and how it is moving us away from the climate change objective of the Paris Agreement. And parallel to the advocacy work with this alliance, we are about to start a project in which we will be testing sustainable recovery models in the 3 countries with population that have been most affected by the pandemic, that is women, indigenous people, young people, and workers. The challenge of this project will be to design pilot development project that land what we understand by sustainable recovery. And as you know, it is a big challenge. All this work with the Alliance has shown us the feasibility and relevance of developing a discourse as a Latin America Alliance in this context. No? Our region is particularly vulnerable to crisis, and both the pandemic and climate change are showing that structural changes are necessary. And in this specific case, we are not looking for a counterweight for the global north. We have 2 other goals. On the one hand, to come together as think tanks to have greater persuasive power with our leaders. And on the other hand, innovate and share about new development models that are adapted to our new reality. Adaptation and resilience. Those are 2 key words for Latin America, and those are common challenges to the entire region. So collaboration between countries is more than welcome to share solutions regarding this complex problem. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Laure. I mean, it's great and it's wonderful to learn of the fact that the collaborative efforts were already in place. You're in setting up the Sustainable Latin America Alliance towards sustainability to ensure we minimize inequality and ensure equity in this recovery, and at the same time still coming to the hard reality that some of the policies, a lot of the recommendations are not being implemented by governments. It's very difficult to move governments. Now, Jane, let me come to you as we wait for Glenn to join. Now, we've had lots of commentary, on South-South cooperation. We just heard from Laure regarding the alliance that was made in Latin America, and how we can leverage this South-South cooperation to ensure that the Global South has its voice really more anchored in these policy discussions on a global scale. From your perspective, what are some good examples of where this South-South cooperation has been successful? What lessons can we learn from them? I know, and Laure just gave an example from Latin America.
Okay, thank you very much again, Denis, for that question. And again, this touches some things that I had said earlier, because remember I mentioned, even where I talked about kind of a unique form of South-South collaboration, where we look at maybe local researchers, government officers, and then we have international experts from the South. So without being selfish, I'll start with what we do, and then I can bring other examples. So I think, as I hinted already, I would say that PEP was actually created for the very purpose of trying to strengthen the possession of Southern expertise and, of course, views in the development policy discourse, both at the local levels and also at the global level. So I would say that our model, I see our model as one very good example, and maybe I'll be mentioning others such as Southern Voice, GDN, and so forth, who are doing more or less the same. And as I said earlier, again, at the core of our strategy, of course, we try to connect and facilitate collaboration between Southern-based researchers and research institutions. And when we talk about that, I'm talking about me sitting in Nairobi and collaborating with an institution and researchers in South America, in Asia, in other parts of Africa, and so forth. So, though initially we are created as a network of institutions, we expanded to be a formal network of individuals and institutions in the global South. And this model of South-South collaboration would say has really helped to create capacity in the global South and to produce experts who've been able to influence policies in the global South. And I would also say that our experience shows that South-South collaborations are usually very fruitful in terms of peer learning and also quality strengthening. And now we are also finding that it's very important in stakeholder outreach and engagement. Others who are doing the same, again, I've mentioned Southern Voice with us here is a very good example. Maybe we can think about Global Development Network. We can think about UNOWIDA. Though UNOWIDA is based in the north, they do a bit of South-South encouraging sometimes. Then we have maybe regional institutions, like if I think about the African Economic Research Consortium, which is kind of driving collaboration within Africa. And all these have helped actually to reach out not just at the regional level, but also at the global level. So maybe just to conclude, I'll say that I don't think that it's really a coincidence that most of these organizations have been built around this kind of South-South collaboration and maybe what I would call a stronger together type of approach, okay? And it seems like this is always very critical to the success of these think tanks. So Denis, I would say that I see PEP as an example. I see Southern Voice, I see GDN, and among others, to be cases where we can say that South-South collaboration has worked very well. And I'm sure that there are quite a number of other organizations who, that are speaking in this conference that can attest to the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And I couldn't agree more with you. I want to really encourage our participants, those who are joining us, to please use the chat button or the Q&A to ask questions. We would also try, if you want to post questions directly to the panelists, if you raise your hands or so, we'll see if you can come on camera. It's always good to hear and see directly from audience participants, to try to mimic the conference the conference setting. So please, we need more engagement as much as possible. But Reina, let me come to you. We just heard from Jane regarding this, South-South, collaboration and how we improve it. Now, specifically, when you look at, the experience in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia regarding the recovery itself, regarding the recovery, how have you seen South-South collaboration towards the recovery from where you sit, and how can you assess that?
Yeah, thank you, Denis. Let me start in a slightly different way. I mean, one of the reasons why we discuss this topic of cooperation South-South is because it is not that easy. I mean, that's obviously we have to put quite some effort into it. And I think this COVID crisis has given us a bit of an opportunity besides the tragedy. It has given us a pandemic that has disclosed global issues that are comparable. And so it made us, in a way, it enabled us to actually look at other countries' experiences and really use them for us. Because normally in our policy papers, at least in ours, our government isn't really interested in international experiences. So we usually have to argue very much on a local level. That might be different in more homogeneous regions like Latin America, that I'm not sure. But in Asia, at least, every country is so different and distinct that that's a bit difficult. But on the COVID side, I was actually in a network and we had these regular conversations. It started very simple on the issue of statistics. I remember we had good conversations between Indonesia and Argentina, struggling with the same questions. How many tests, are they reliable, the numbers that we get, the number of deaths, etc. It was a major issue at the beginning. So what are reliable numbers? Sometimes you had to look at the number of funerals in order to find out the death rate rather than the reported ones, because the hospitals are not that good at reporting. And then there was the stigma, etc. So it started with the statistics, and then it went in as the pandemic unfolded. We had the issue of fiscal stimulus programs, which ones were more successful, how was it done, etc. And then we ended up with the whole issue of education policies. The whole world is struggling with the question whether the kids can go back to school, and if so, in which way, etc. So I think it gives us an enormous opportunity at the moment to actually sit together like what we're doing right now and to discuss about issues. And we have definitely engaged in this, and has helped us quite a bit.
And thank you very much. Now, Reina, just to follow up regarding your work in Indonesia on the recovery on COVID itself. Can you talk a little bit regarding that work? Because I think it's very impressive regarding some of the issues of food insecurity and how the problem is exacerbated with COVID, and what you all are trying to do in that area.
Sure. Indonesia is a huge country, fourth biggest in the world. So you can imagine it's a large one with lots of districts and provinces. And as the pandemic happened, and I'm sure that happened in many of the countries participating today, is that the provinces, the districts, even the villages closed their borders and said, this is too risky. We don't want anyone to come in. If we produce rice, we keep it. We're not trading it with anyone because we don't know what's going to happen. So logistics basically fell apart, plus all the question about who's going to allow back to work. So the factories weren't able to produce, the trucks weren't able to go, etc. So we did extensive work on how to open up logistics just so that get the food from A to B. While we're having a pandemic. It was a very tricky question because you had all the hygiene rules that need to be applied. So that was a big one that we were dealing with. Similar also, we looked into the whole vaccination issue. There it's a matter of distribution. That's again a topic I think shared in many of the countries here. So how do you make sure that the vaccines really get to the people? Not every government administration was very effective in doing this, so we tried to come up with recommendations how to speed up the process and so on. So, but on the food issue, I think it was mostly logistics. We were also affected internationally. We were really concerned that something like 2008 would happen again when we had the global food crisis and several countries stopped their exports. Russia stopped, India stopped, and those who were at the receiving end suddenly had a shortage in barley, a shortage in many other commodities. So we were very busy writing papers about at least the government that we are trying to influence, do not close your borders for commodities right now. We need to keep this going. Otherwise, in 2008, the global food crisis was very much exaggerated and exacerbated by the fact that several countries closed their borders to food trade. And so we want to prevent that. In the end, it didn't happen in 2020. Luckily, some countries closed their borders for a little while to exports and imports, mostly more for logistics reasons. They didn't have the transport workers and the harbors, etc. But generally speaking, luckily, the countries didn't close up. And so that was prevented.
Thank you. Now, I again encourage our participants to continue to send their questions in the chat, and if they want to provide or to make a to pose a question directly to any of our speakers, our panelists, to indicate that in the chat. I will take two questions currently and pass it on to our panelists for them to get their thoughts. The first one is from Vanessa, which says, how think tanks from the South, particularly those from Africa, can act in favor of vulnerable layers when they sometimes present themselves as organizations that have been weakened by the coronavirus? So saying, the capacity of think tanks in the global South is weak, so it becomes difficult for them to actually take the lead in this. I don't know, either Laure or Jane can come on that. I have a second question to follow. Can the South speak with one voice in this post-COVID world when its different components face different problems? That's a very interesting one. So I'll go for Laure and Jane. Laure, you want to go first and then Jane follows?
Thank you very much. To answer this, I will have to speak Spanish. So please, the interpreter, the English one, could you be ready? Ok, voy a contestar. Ok, perfecto, ya lo oigo. Voy a contestar a la segunda pregunta. Si el sur puede hablar con una sola voz en el mundo post-COVID. Es una pregunta sumamente interesante. O sea, yo creo que la primera pregunta antes de eso es si es deseable que el sur hable con una sola voz en el contexto de la pandemia. Depende mucho de los objetivos que tengamos. Si queremos, o sea, el hecho de que el sur hable con una sola voz implica que el sur tiene algo que decirle al norte respecto a lo que está pasando, ¿no? Es lo que yo estaría asumiendo. Y en este caso, sabemos que está habiendo problemas, digamos, en términos de justicia, en términos de acceso a las vacunas. Entonces, en este caso, sí, por supuesto, el sur tiene que hablar con una sola voz y tiene que denunciar lo que está pasando para que el norte sea mucho más, digamos, responsable, ¿no? de lo que está pasando en cuanto a la distribución de vacunas. Si nos vamos con un tema como el de la recuperación sostenible, el Building Back Better, yo diría que es un poco más complejo, efectivamente, porque las problemáticas de desarrollo sí son muy propias para cada región. Y en el caso, por ejemplo, de Latinoamérica, estoy pensando, ¿no?, en la experiencia que tenemos con la Alianza Latinoamérica Sostenible. En realidad, con esta alianza no le queremos decir nada a los países del norte. Lo que queremos es cómo promovemos una recuperación sostenible en los países de América Latina, ¿no? Siempre es bueno tener experiencia de otras regiones. Pueden ser países de la Unión Europea, países de África, países de Asia, o sea, en este sentido de colaboración, que puede ser sur-sur, que puede ser norte-sur. En este caso, yo creo que cualquier tipo de experiencia es buena, porque la problemática que enfrentamos realmente, sí, ya lo mencionó Reiner, es una problemática sumamente retadora para todos nosotros. Entonces, eso sería mi respuesta. Depende de qué es lo que estamos buscando. Para algunas temáticas sí, para otras temáticas no forzosamente. Gracias.
Thank you, Laure, for that. I fully agree. I mean, I think it's on point. Some things, yes, collaboration or one voice, and others very different, especially vaccine equity being one that is really in our faces. Jane, any comments on either of?
Okay, thank you, Denis, and thank you to Vanessa for the question. I want to pick the question from Vanessa, which I think is a very interesting question because he's saying that I'll put myself as the executive director of the Southern think tank, and he's saying that asking how can we act in favor of vulnerable areas. So I'm assuming those are maybe the poor. When sometimes we present ourselves as organizations that have been weakened by the coronavirus pandemic. Okay, first what I would say is that we know very well that institutions in the Global South, even countries in the Global South, have been adversely affected by the pandemic. It is for sure. And this is the equity conundrum that we are talking about. We are not at the same position as organizations in the North, or even countries in the North. Of course, it all depends on the mandate of the think tank. This is what I would say. First, if I give an example of a think tank such as PEP, my mandate, our mandate is capacity building. And it's capacity building in research and policy engagement. This is what we support. But we have a special focus to support researchers, policymakers from the low-income countries and also fragile states. We try as much as possible. So when you're talking about the vulnerable areas, to me, those are my vulnerable areas. Of course, I'll support those within the means of what I have. What has happened with the coronavirus pandemic is that funding priorities have changed. Some funders have actually changed their priorities, maybe to support vaccine research in their countries, to support COVID crisis impacts in their own countries, and maybe reducing the amount of money that is available for capacity building. But still, with what I have, I'll still continue supporting my vulnerable researchers, policymakers in that particular respect. So I'll just say the same, that what we've seen with countries in the Global South, though we have said that they have been adversely affected by the crisis, inequalities have increased, that does not mean that our countries are not resilient in their own ways. I think the countries in the Global South are still coping much better than was expected. I think some of you listened to Bill Gates and his wife sometime in 2020, when there was a prediction as to how the masses would be dying in Africa because of coronavirus. Yet, I think the adjustments that we put in place, the kind of partly the fiscal stimulus packages, the economic stimulus packages, the lockdown measures, our own weak social protection, these policies seem to have worked in one way or another and have actually cushioned us from the expected effects of the crisis. So maybe Denis, that's what I would say.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that. And I think we have Len joining us now. Len, I don't know if you can hear us. If I can get your mic unmuted. And just to thank you very much for that. It's been difficult, but I wanted to, now that we have you, quickly get your thoughts on some of the important discussions that we've been having here. Now, when we talk about glocalization and this concept of glocalization, which was first advocated in the late 90s, now we still see today that there's still a major deficit, in international development policies being contextualized to really fit the realities of individual regions or individual countries or so. Let me get your thoughts as to why you think that's the case. Why is it that we are not still really able to glocalize these policies the way many of us have been advocating for? And also, what are some of the barriers that you see for Global South and think tanks in really helping to glocalize this development agenda?
Thank you so very much, Denis. Colleagues, my apologies. I feel as if I have flirted in and out of this very interesting conversation, and I'm now parachuted in towards the end. And really, I'm sorry about that. But coming to the questions, Denis, thanks again for your patience. I think that there are several issues here, and one of the ones that really I think is pertinent is this whole issue or perception that there are barriers that have to be overcome by global South think tanks to glocalize development policies. But I think if we step back and reflect a little bit, I think it's quite important to recognize an inalienable truth almost, which is that think tanks are not policy makers per se. Mm-hmm. They may interrogate policies, they may recommend policies, but they don't make policies. Neither do they implement policies either. And typically those policies come to us in the developing world, in the global South, from a number of institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the EU, for example. Mm-hmm. But we don't have the ability to, in fact, either implement or to articulate those policies ourselves. But I think what we do have working for us is our ability to interrogate the policies that are put on the table for our governments or blocks of regions to interrogate. And we can assist with the sort of intellectual work that's required to help our regions or countries actually shape the best sort of priorities, the best sort of policies that in fact they want with respect of our own vision for our own development and our own journeys. I think that's the one of the most important roles of think tanks themselves. That ability to interrogate, to recommend, and to give support to the intellectual work of many of our governments and many of our regions, many of the secretariats that don't necessarily have the full capacity. The second quick thing I would say in speaking with think tanks from the global South is also very quickly to say that we don't do ourselves great favors by only talking to each other, because we are the converted, we are the ones who know. So the issue of partnerships with think tanks, with other types of agendas, but on the other side from the north are very important, because they set the tables, perhaps we will not be invited, and they then can influence and advocate on our behalf collectively with their government, who are in fact trying to understand that development continuum. Two quick observations I would also make is that in my own experience working in development and working with the EU and World Bank and others, is that it's far easier to construct a development cooperation approach which attempts to be wide and broad, because then you hope to capture many different things. The devil is in the details, and that's where the problem usually is. So that when we see the EU's relationship with Africa in this new partnership with Africa, which has been unveiled in advance of the EU-AU summit, for example, we get the sense of an Africa as a homogeneous region, and it is not. Beyond shared geographies, we have countries within Africa at all different levels and ends of the development spectrum. So that is not very helpful either. And I think two other very quick things that I would just want to say, and I'm rushing here, is that quite often there is a lack of understanding of the problems on the ground by development partners. And it's not that they come without good intentions, but as I've always said to friends who are on the other side in terms of articulating development policies or approaches for development cooperation with the global South, I've always said that honorable intentions are not bankable assets. But quite often there are procedures for us to access loans or grants, but we can't meet the conditionalities, because when we look at tiny islands in the Caribbean, if tendering for EU money and projects requires 6 bids, but you're in a small regional market where there's one supplier, what do you do? And that becomes a little bit of a conundrum. The other is, of course, we are at different stages of development. We can't necessarily have the capacity to absorb all different types of technology. Neither do we have the capacity for all of the type of reporting that's required. That becomes a little bit of a problem. And the last quick thing I would just say on this whole issue of, you know, that disconnect almost in terms of the development policies that are required for us, is a sense that, and it's not just Global North that feels this way, I think we feel this way as well, that we approach development as if it is a linear construct, that all countries move naturally from low to higher types of development. But development is not a linear construct. Once we get to middle income, of course, all countries are graduated. There are other sorts of conditional tests that we must meet. These countries that are from low to middle income successfully, let's say, they're countries in transition. And they do slip into lower forms of development and increased poverty because of frozen conflicts because of all kinds of. So I think when we think about development and policies, we've got to get out of that mindset that, in fact, it's one straight line, but it can't, it isn't in reality. And the last quick thing that I would say is that when you ask the question, well, what should global think tanks do? Well, then our role should be to put the spotlight on the specific challenges faced by countries in the global south, whether it's debt, the technology divide, financing for development, negotiated migration policies that can work. We can influence the discussion around development theory, practice, and development paradigms. We can articulate what those are. We can support development partners in fashioning their own approach to development with us. We can provide lessons of experience, South-South, to each other, as I did from the Caribbean, exporting certain of our models in Pacific SIDS, for example, and develop the research competencies that allow us to be able to sit at the table as valuable partners with others from the North to articulate shifts in development thinking that can work for us, and win-wins, of course, because development partners want wins on the ground as well. But anyway, I think together with good partnerships, we can come to the point where we finesse our own ability to consider what development means for us.
Wow, thank you very much, Len, for that really in depth, and I really thank you for reminding us of what a role think tanks have, because I think at the end of the day we are always wanting to, once the data, you know, is there as to what needs to be done, we always want to see it done. But as you reminded us, think tanks are not policy makers, you know, and think tanks also do not implement policy. We want to influence it. We want to make sure that the policymakers, they do the thing that is beneficial for their populations, but we are dealing obviously in a political climate, and it's not easy. I also found it very instructive as you reminded us about development and the fact that we always tend to look at it as a linear construct, as you say, when in all reality is very circular. And you know, it goes fits and pieces. But just so since I have you, let me just ask one more question before I go back to the team, since I have you here. How have you, you know, when you look at the pandemic itself, just the pandemic and the experience that what you've seen regarding the response of the pandemic, what are some examples that you may have as to how particular countries have responded, and countries that have responded well, you know, or regions that have responded well? I know the Caribbeans, you know, is made up of a lot of micro states, if I may use that word, micro states. What was the response from what has been the response from Caribbean countries?
I think, Dennis, thanks for that. You put me right back to my roots. I think what is interesting is that microstates understand fundamentally that when there are crises, they need each other more, not less. So they start from that. Whereas when bigger countries are facing states tend to become much more introspective, much more about their citizens and nationalistic. Microstates in the Caribbean realize in times of turbulence, they're so small, they need to get together in an even deeper way to reduce and act to those, deal with those threats as a single group. And so what we have seen, and it has been very interesting in the Lancet Commission on COVID, to see the distinct difference between the experience of Latin American countries that's so much bigger, so much better resource, and the microstates of the Caribbean, because the microstates of the Caribbean have relied very, very much on regional mechanisms to be able to face to and respond to the pandemic. So that you find the 9 islands in the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, tiny little islands.
Yeah, Len, I think that the audio is very difficult to hear, but I think what I could make, I will just try later, but what I could make was the fact that, microstates tend to be more collaborative, knowing rather than nationalistic, as we see in larger states, and they look at the conflict more as all of us in this boat together. So they are more collaborative, and they've acted in that collaborative way and going forward. So thank you for that. I'll get back to you, but let me ask one more question to the panel. Actually, we have 2 questions here as we wrap up. Now, as we wrap up, I would like our speakers to just think of really the fundamentals that what we're trying to get here in our call. What is it that multilaterals and governments should be doing? What direct policy recommendations should multilateral organizations and major stakeholders be doing to ensure an equitable recovery? And secondly, what exactly do we recommend that think tanks, especially those of us in the global south, what specific recommendations do we have for those think tanks? So, dear panelists, please start formulating your thoughts on those things. But I have 2 questions. One from Henry, which says, how does the level of informality impact gender equality and equity? In Cameroon, for example, over 50% of entrepreneurs in the informal sector are women. And can this have impact on the outcomes over the long run? That is one. The second question that I have is from Dr. Ahanda. South-South collaboration is good, but what is its impact on the possible influence on state policy if taken individually at the time? So, Reina, let me come to you for you to pick and choose what you respond to from these 2 questions, and then I'll get Laure and Jane.
Sorry, but you would need to explain to me the question on South-South collaboration. What is meant by possible influence on state policies if taken individually? I can't quite understand.
My inference is that the state policies for, like, let's say Indonesia or Cameroon or so you are having Laure was indicating the alliance in Latin America or so, but then you have to influence let's say Mexico alone or something. For Mexico still makes its own decision.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let me then address that one. That's something we are dealing with very much. I mean, our researchers and our think tank always like to pick international experiences in their studies because they want to show it has worked somewhere. But the big problem is that we're talking about glocalization. Why did it work in another country? We don't know. There are so many factors: history, culture, economy, social. There are so many other factors that play a role. So it's very hard to actually refer to other countries' experiences. I mean, we even talk about differences within a country already, then international is even harder. And so I believe we need to be very careful, the examples that we choose. We need to be very careful that we make sure they are comparable. There are countries with similar background, with similar experiences, but we need to be academically very careful and also policy-minded, that we choose the right examples. And in case of doubt, rather not, because it might be a waste of effort to actually write about it. But when you have them, then it's really worthwhile describing it. For example, just give an example, we worked on community forestry. So how can partial property rights help to prevent deforestation? And there are very interesting examples in the world, especially in the South, which we could use from Africa, from Asia. I don't think we had an example from Latin America, but generally speaking, we had good examples. And these were strong examples because we felt that it would actually be relatable by Indonesian policymakers. But yeah, I think you just have to be very, very careful when you choose your examples and can't just talk about this is happening in other countries and therefore we should also try it. That usually, in my experience, doesn't work with policymakers.
Well, thank you very much for that. Now, let me just ask to you, and I know our team is going to do a poll regarding what our participants think should be the response from governments and multilaterals, and what think tanks should be doing. But let me pose the question to you, Reina, since I have you. Those two questions, or what are some of your recommendations?
In a way, it's on us. I mean, it's easy to demand it from others. I do believe we need to create a dialogue in our countries. We need to speak to IMF or at least World Bank if we have an office there. We need to engage. Usually, I mean, at least in our experience, you get lots of good analysis and data and research from the World Bank. So that's already helpful. In order to collaborate across borders, if we want this to happen, really, I believe is up to us. We really need to make it happen. And so that's why this initiative here is excellent. And I think we should just regroup as much as we can in other networks.
Thank you. Let me come to you, Jane, regarding the two Sentinel questions, but I know there was also a question on the panel from a Q&A if you were on the SouthSouth collaboration, which you already talked about, and the issue of informality on women. How can you have an impact over the long run? But are you able to make any comment on the informality aspect and then lump that into your recommendations?
Okay, thank you. I think I would take it more generally, looking at maybe a kind of what I see as most critical at maybe a bigger level. And maybe the way I would look at it is first say that I know we are talking about South-South collaboration. I know, I think someone hinted at also maybe thinking about North-South collaboration and so forth. But I think what I would say is that it's the Southern experts who should actually be at the core of trying to influence policies or strategies for improving the welfare or the well-being of millions in the South. But still, having said that, we know that there's still a very significant gap between maybe the South and the North, both in terms of opportunities and maybe in terms of human capital. So maybe what would help, and this then can trickle down to whether you are dealing with women as someone has raised, whether in informality and so forth, is maybe to continue raising awareness at the global level that there's really urgent need to increase participation of Southern experts in kind of shaping their own destiny. The other one, I would also say that I would see it as very critical to facilitate engagement and collaborative working between producers are direct users of knowledge. Because if you do that, this is where you can then go down to those issues, whether you are dealing with informality, whether you are dealing with women. So on one side, you have the producers of knowledge, whether the researchers in the global South who understand the local context, they will see the issues of informality, they will see the issues of inequalities, gender differentials, and so forth. And then they can work together with the direct users of that knowledge, the people who would actually work on policies that can impact on whether it's that informality, whether there are those local inequalities, because remember there's a difference between inequalities within the countries, but then there are inequalities that are maybe more perpetuated by what is happening out there. But I think my point is we need that kind of collaborative working together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I totally agree. Laure, let me come to you regarding your thoughts on those two central questions. You've already started in the alliance or so, but multilateral organizations and major countries, the G7, the G20 or so, or mainly the G7 and multilaterals, as well as what we think tankers from the Global South should be doing for this equitable recovery.
De nuevo voy a dar mi respuesta en español.
Oui.
Gracias. Es que es una pregunta bastante compleja. Esta crisis pone en el centro como actores a los gobiernos nacionales, ¿no? Frente a las crisis, son cada uno de los gobiernos los que tienen que pues luchar, enfrentar y diseñar, implementar políticas. Entonces, lo que hemos visto nosotros desde la Alianza, pero también como think tank mexicano, es que el gobierno mexicano en este contexto puede oír muy poco, tiene muy poca capacidad para absorber respuestas de fuera. ¿Por qué? Porque está enfrentando una crisis. Entonces, la mayor parte de nuestros gobiernos, tengo la impresión de que están en una lógica de actuar de manera emergente, con finanzas públicas dañadas, ¿no? Y entonces hay muy poco espacio de diálogo con otros actores. Entonces, ha sido complicado justamente poder establecer un diálogo con el gobierno, y aún más cuando quieres hablar de recuperación sostenible o de building back better, que implican una visión de largo plazo, cuando los gobiernos están en una visión totalmente cortoplacista y del día al día y de estar revisando cuántas muertes, etcétera, etcétera. Tal vez desde ahora ya va a empezar a ser el momento de poder tener este tipo de conversación con los gobiernos. Y ahí sí creo que haber trabajado, por ejemplo, con la Alianza Latinoamericana desde hace un año nos da mucha fuerza para ya estar listos para dar recomendaciones que realmente sean implementables. Por ejemplo, muchos organismos internacionales sacaron muy buenos informes comentando qué debería de ser la recuperación verde o la recuperación sostenible. Pero en los hechos nadie tiene la respuesta. Y es lo que hace esta crisis tan interesante, y bien lo comentaban los otros comentaristas. En este caso, los países del norte tampoco tienen la respuesta. O sea, todos estamos frente a nuestra propia crisis, todos con nuestros problemas, y no hay mucho de dónde ver buenos ejemplos o casos de éxito, ¿no? Como siempre lo hacemos. No hay muchos, todavía los estamos construyendo. Entonces, eso sería como mi respuesta. Digamos, ese es el panorama, y tenemos que replantear por completo, en el marco de esta crisis, la forma en que vemos cooperación norte-sur, cooperación sur-sur. Gracias.
Thank you very much for that. And I speaking truth there. It's very complicated and obviously very complicated talking with governments, very political entities. They are very focused on the next election, and you're talking about something that's 20 years down the line, and most of them don't see themselves or going past the next election. So it's very complicated. Now, as we wrap up, we are going to have Professor Robert Nanchuan to just summarize the session for us. But let me come to you, Len, to try to get your thoughts on those two key questions. So, what should multilaterals and the big players, the G7, be doing towards this equitable recovery that we want? And specifically, if one or two few recommendations to what think tankers like us, like you all are doing or should be doing.
Thank you very much, Denis. Could you tell me if the audio is any better?
It's slightly better now. Yes, we can try to get it.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll just stick with one particular element. I think we can all agree that sometime last year, well, I certainly was a little bit surprised, stunned by the guidance which we were receiving from the World Bank, IMF in particular, which was for countries of the South to take much more debt so that they could fight COVID and position themselves to recover post-COVID. And I was a little bit stunned because, of course, normal guidance is what's the bottom line? We don't want debt that is unsustainable, which is part of the characteristics of being a country in the global South. So we had that guidance, and we were also told, don't worry, we will figure that out together, how we repay that debt so that it's not unsustainable. So the G20 came out with the DSSI as a mechanism which allowed some suspension of debt, okay? With the thinking that we would have different sorts of modalities that would deal with this debt overhang as a result of all of this spending, which we had been encouraged to undertake. But now we're starting to take a look at the disjunct between that guidance and where we are today in November of 2021. And some numbers are really, really not encouraging at all. So that the public debt of the developing world in the last 9 years has moved from 40 to almost 63% of GDP from the global South. But significantly, 25% of that, or almost 2 trillion, happened in 2020. We experienced last year and this year a net negative transfer on external public debt of almost 200 billion in 2020. In other words, we from the global South sent out $200 billion more than we received in support. And the last quick number, which is for me a little bit alarming, is that under the DSSI modality, 5.3 billion of debt service was suspended in 2020. Yet, interestingly, developing countries paid more than 70 times that amount to their creditors. Where does that leave us? So I think that there's a big disjunct between the rhetoric from 20 months ago, don't worry, we're in this boat together. We're not safely on the other side until we're all there together. Then now there is the need for a lot of not just introspection, but reflection within the global community and all of us with respect of how we are sustainably going to come out of this debt, because the implications short, medium, and long term for development are stark. Already all the analysis point to SDG goals dealing with health, education, environment, and so many more are not going to be met by the many countries in the global South. We have COP26 taking place right now in Glasgow, where we talk about great new deals and all of those sort of things. But in reality, what does it mean for the global South? And that's the only reflection that I think I'd like to leave with at this point in time, because it's a sobering one.
It is a very sobering one, Len, for the amount of debt and where we are today. Now, I think this has been a very wonderful conversation. I want to, in the next 2 or 3 minutes, actually, I want to bring in Robert and Antoine, Prof. Antoine, to just give us a summary of what are some of the lessons that we are getting from this conversation in 5 minutes or less. That way we can, actually less than 4 minutes or so. That way we got to get out at the top of the hour for sure. Robert, just a quick summary. You are muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, for giving me the floor. Thank you, Denis, for initiating this food for thought session. Allow me also to congratulate the panelists on the mastery of the subject. Dear participant, the purpose of our today's gathering was to discuss the role of global South think tanks in shaping an equitable post-COVID world. During the discussion, the panel explored ways through which cooperative actions by global South think tanks could translate into decolonized, or what we said, glocalized policies and concrete action. Why? Because the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the illusion of a strong North-South cooperation in global development. Indeed, in the pandemic response, countries in the global North have circumvented multilateral frameworks, injecting liquidity into the economies and stockpile vaccines. Meanwhile, countries in the global South had no access to these multilateral platforms, and many have been unable to purchase COVID-19 vaccines directly from manufacturers. And as a result, North-South inequality has widened further since the pandemic. So what do we take away from the conversation we just have? One main point was the need for more cooperation. Yes, panelists have recognized the need for more cooperation, but the issue was, can the South speak with one voice? And the answer was yes, they can speak with one voice when they have facing a common problem. And the COVID pandemic is a good opportunity to strengthen the South-South cooperation, because this has not been easy so far. The dialogue between South and South has not been easy so far. The panel also put in front the issue of policy actions. Yes, we all recognize that the South of the countries, governors are very good from time to time in developing policies or strategies. However, the implementation remains the main issue. And this applies to the implementation, or this applies also to the implementation of research findings. So we did recognize that think tanks are just thinkers, but they are not policy makers. So there's a need to find a way so that think tanks can influence policy maker, so that they can put into action what comes out from the research. And here, again, because G20 will be taking place in a country from the South, this gives a great opportunity to bring to the floor issues faced by the South, because indeed the host country has its say when it is hosting such a big event, such the G20. About the policy recommendation, we all agree that there's need to support think tanks, to support research, especially vulnerable experts from the South. Capacity is a missing link. We finally recognize that things are not so worse, because the South has suffered less than what was anticipated, even if the women have been, we could say, they have shared the greatest part of job losses, as we did recognize everywhere, even in Mexico. Last, thank you, Mr. Chair. What I could retain from the discussion that we had And let me thank again the participant and say shukran. Thank you very much. Asante. Muchas gracias to all of you. Merci beaucoup. I didn't hear French.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of Southern Voice, on behalf of Nkafu, and on behalf of our very, very expert panelists, I want to thank you all for this wonderful conversation. I want to thank Jane, Laure, Len, Reina for a wonderful opportunity here to moderate these important conversations. Lots of lessons learned. The call will be circulated to you all, and I wish you all a great afternoon, great evening, great morning wherever you are. So thank you very much, and thank you to the Southern Voice team.
Thank you, Denis. Thank you, Southern Voice. Thank you, everyone, my fellow panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Have a nice one.